So thank you all for coming. I don't know, some people may not be used to Zoom. If you look on the lower bar, there'll be a little bubble and it will say chat below it, like a little cartoon talk bubble. If you click on that, you'll have an ability to text to the group or to each other. Actually, you can have silent conversations on your own that I won't see. So, oh, well done. And there's also, as Dean Stockwell is showing us, if you go to reactions, usually I hold that to the end, but Dean is on it. And you can give the speaker some love with thumbs and hellos. You can also, I think, raise your hand. Well done, Dean. You can also raise your hand and such. So it is interactive. Even if you're not speaking, you can communicate to the group for some reason. We do have a call-in from Diomede. They're following along on the a printout that went out earlier on the helicopter, not during this weather, but just made it out in time. And do know that we are doing this online in this presentation series to help sort of bridge the digital divide that we have in this region that the pandemic has actually really brought to the forefront. I will check later, but I think we do have some local media here, and they'll do their part to help push this story throughout our region. So tonight we have Kathy Kuletz. She's the lead seabird biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Management. She is no stranger to Nome or the Bering Strait region. And while we, for the last few years, have seen die-offs of birds and our ecosystem seems to be shifting quite dramatically in the marine environment, Kathy's had the unique opportunity of being offshore a lot of the time on U.S. Coast Guard vessels, national research vessels, agency vessels, and she's been able to look at offshore what's been happening with the seabirds. And so I'm really excited and grateful that Kathy's able to join us tonight and sort of give us what's the offshore picture and how that might compare to what we've been seeing here on our beaches and on our cliffs. With that, take it away, Kathy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kay. Okay, I'm going to try sharing my screen here now and get started. This worked earlier and hopefully it will again, but
I'm sure it will. There's always a little bit of a pause.
Yeah. So hopefully this will.
We are not seeing it. There you go. Now we're seeing you. There we go. Well done. And you just need to, there you go. Hit that presentation screen.
I did. Okay, there we go. Thank you.
All right. Well done. Take it away. Thank you so much. Kathy, you are on mute. No worries. It's the world of Zoom. If you go down to the lower left, there should be a little microphone with a red bar through it. Just click on that till it's green. Or I will unmute you.
Okay, it hid for me. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're on. All good. Get the glitches out of the way right in the front and then you're all set.
Okay. I can't seem to go back to, or maybe there's delay from my title, but I'm talking about the seabirds' response to the warming in the Bering Sea and the title slide, which doesn't seem to want to go up to now.
You want me to use the PDF version then if you're, maybe Anchorage does have some internet glitch.
No, we'll try this. This is fine. I did want to acknowledge that a lot of the work I'm going to be presenting had contributions from Dan Cushing, who did a lot of the analysis and maps you'll see, and Liz Lubunsky likewise, and you probably know her from being on the ships and up in the region for over the years, but also others have been involved. I'm going to show some work from folks from NOAA, like David Kimmel, and we've been working with Adrian Gall, and others. I don't have the names right here in front of me. So going right now, I want to first start off with the acknowledgements, and that's that we've been supported by, besides Fish and Wildlife, who we work for, the surveys themselves have been supported by BOEM and North Pacific Research Board, and we've had a lot of support from NOAA, who has had us on their ships. We've been involved in a variety of programs in addition. And I do want to recognize that we're working in the lands and waters of the Inupiaq and Yupik peoples as well. Boy, this is, it's not moving for me.
All right, so what we'll do, thank you for being patient audience. We're having a bit of a slow start, but it's sort of like that tonight with the
I'm going to try again. Let me try sharing my screen again and see.
All right.
If it does better.
And it sounds like maybe with your earlier glitch in the day that Anchorage is having some issue, which is.
Okay, we'll try that now. So as most of you know, the northern Bering and Chukchi Sea ecosystem supports millions of seabirds, and but it's also been undergoing some rapid changes, some dramatic changes. And this has affected seabirds at their colonies and affects their food. And of course, as Gay mentioned earlier, there's been some unprecedented Seabird Die-offs in the region. And I think Rob Kaler in our office gave you a talk last year about this. The map in the middle shows some of the departure from normal temperatures. This is from 2018, 2017 to 2019 were some of the warmest on record for the region. So beyond Seabird Die-offs, what are seabirds telling us? And in addition, how are they responding to the changes that we're seeing out there? And we're looking at seabirds both at sea. That's mainly what I'll talk about because birds spend most of their lives at sea. And this includes breeders and non-breeders and migrants as well. And young of the year at the end of the, late in the summer. But it also involves what goes on at the colonies. And these are the breeding populations, which of course will have a lot to do with population trends in the future. So our methods, I'm going to mainly talk about data we've collected from 2007 through 2019. This involves visual at-sea surveys on vessels and colony monitoring. The at-sea surveys, most of where we get all the offshore data, we've covered now over 150,000 kilometers of transects in this region. We usually cut those into 3-kilometer segments to calculate densities, that is birds per kilometer square. And then we often, for many of the analyses you'll see here, we group these little segments into 30-kilometer grid cells and then look at trends across an area using those grid cells. The colony monitoring, I will touch on that a bit, and that's done mainly by the Alaska Maritime, folks at the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge based out of Homer. And they use plot counts. They have a whole army of people they put out on various islands and along the coast. They have plot counts. They go back to monitor trends in abundance and their productivity. So our offshore work has depended, as I mentioned, on a lot of partners. Besides the support from BOEM and NPRB, we've worked with the University of Alaska, other universities, NOAA particularly, but all these other groups listed here, these are various projects that we've been part of. And they run the gamut from US and NOAA-led, and National Science Foundation-led, a project led by Canada on their icebreakers, and then Japan as well. And in the past, we have done some work with Russia through the Rusalka program. So I want to acknowledge all those. So as I mentioned earlier, not only does it have most of the high numbers of seabirds in this region, but it has some of the largest colonies in the world. And these, so some of these colonies that you can see on the map in the center there, they're stars. The larger ones have in the millions, and the smaller ones in hundreds of thousands. The region hosts birds from the southern hemisphere, and they come up here to feed, and we have all these birds breeding here because of the abundance of food. And this can include both zooplankton and fish, of a variety of fish. The map here shows several things. Besides, this is our survey effort. The darker the cell, the more kilometers of survey done in those transects over a number of years. And then, as I mentioned, the stars indicate the colonies. And then the black boxes indicate the distributed biological observatory sites. And these are internationally recognized areas that projects from all over the Pacific will come and sample within these blocks. And then it makes it easier to share data within these particular sample areas. So we use those a lot, and we depend on ships that go to sample these areas. So the seabird communities in the Pacific Arctic, one thing we did with all these at sea survey data is conducted a cluster analysis to figure out what communities, if we wanted to define communities, these are birds that tend to cluster together in time and space. And when we did a survey using data from analysis from 2007 to 2015, we broke out into 6 different communities. So these communities have might have a variety of birds in them. And some of the same birds might be in different communities as well. But they most often are dominated by one species. So it's easy just to refer to them as this species dominant community. So the map here shows how these 6 communities were distributed in the study area, North Bering Sea and Chukchi and into the Beaufort. They basically break down into what we call the Northern Fulmore colony. That's the purple down here and near the shelf break area, the outer shelf. The shearwater cluster, which is kind of hard to make out in this because it's buried and it stakes all the way up here through. It's the blue cells here. The thick-billed murre colony cluster, which is the purple. A lot of you see down here in the northern Bering Sea and a little bit up around here around Cape Lisburne area. And then this diagram here also gives you an idea of how abundant, how abundant the birds are within this cluster, how dense they are. So you can see that this particular cluster, the least auklet cluster, has the most birds. It's the highest density. That's the red here. That's basically runs from Chirikov Basin through the Bering Strait and a little bit into Hope Basin there. It's high density mainly because of least auklets, but there's also a lot of short-tailed shearwaters involved, and they are crested auklets and a variety of birds. But because they're squeezed through the Bering Strait here, that's one reason the densities are so high, perhaps. And then we have the crested auklet, an interesting cluster of birds up here in the northern Chukchi Sea. And the final group doesn't have a dominant species. It's very low. You see this very low abundance cluster F. We call that the low density, and that's the low density cluster. And this is all along the eastern for the most part. And it does extend a little bit, especially up in the north, up to the west and all the way into the Beaufort Sea. Very low densities of birds with no dominant species. So that's just to give you an idea of what communities we're dealing with up there. You can also look at the birds up there in terms of those that are wanderers and those that are more homebodies, those that breed here. And the main bird up there that comes up here in the summer that does not breed here is the short-tailed shearwater. Now this is now that shearwater dominated cluster broken out separately so you can see it better. But this is the blue, see it basically follows along the coastal current and goes all the way up here into Point Bureau and a little into the Bering Sea, into the Beaufort Sea. Excuse me. So it's widely distributed. They like to feed near fronts and at currents. They're feeding mainly on krill. And then we have the homebodies like the thick-billed murres and other colonial birds that actually nest here. And you can see that they tend to be clustered more around where the colonies are. They're limited on where they can feed and how far they can go because they have to bring fish back to their chicks, where something like the shearwater is not breeding up here. They breed actually down in Australia and just come up here for the summer. So those thick-billed murres have to carry individual fish back to their chicks, and they have different needs, and thus as you would expect, might have different responses to changes in local conditions. The other group the other way to look at it are birds that feed mainly on plankton and those that feed mainly on fish. So the planktivorous birds include auklets and shearwaters, and they're dominant in the offshore waters of the North Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea. One thing I want to point out, the maps here show their distribution, and the darker colors indicate really high densities here. This is a mix of least auklets and crested auklets, but we're talking about least auklets here. And note how very high these densities are in the darker colors, up around 90 birds per kilometer square. Excuse me?
Kathy, this is Gay. Just because we have a call-in speaker working on off a printed copy, listening in by telephone, I just wanted to let them know we're on the slide, and you may want to mention as you go on kind of where you are in your presentation, what may be on the slide. I know there may be a mismatch there since you sent a little bit of a revised version, but for the person who's listening in, know that we're on the slide that says planktivorous, starts with planktivorous auklets at the top in yellow.
Right, and there's two major.
Yep. Okay, thank you. And thank you. Sorry for the interruption, but just wanted to remind that we do have a caller following along.
No problem. Thanks for the reminder. It would have been good if I had numbers, I guess, in these slides for that purpose.
That's all right. We'll figure it out. No worries.
So the planktivorous auklets in shearwaters, they dominate offshore waters in the North Bering and the Chukchi Sea. But what's interesting is that the least auklets don't actually nest up here in the Chukchi Sea. They nest down here, as you're probably aware, in the northern Bering Sea and in some areas farther south down to the Aleutians. The only auklet that does nest up here is the parakeet auklet in low numbers. And they are also the only auklet that will eat fish in addition to krill. So we have planktivorous birds in the offshore waters, very high densities. And then we have the piscivorous birds, the fish-eating birds, mainly larids, that's the gulls and such, and the alcids. And they're also widespread, but at much lower densities. I'm looking here at 3 maps for the kittiwake, one for the murre, thick-billed murre, and one for puffins. And just point out that while some of these densities might get high, there's a couple cells that get up to 60 birds per kilometer square. Most of them in this map here for the kittiwake are right around 1 or less than 1 bird per kilometer square. Okay, and so these birds do nest both in the North Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea. So one thing we know from looking at long-term data, we're now looking at 2 graphs showing the long-term trends from 2007 to 2019. And this is how the abundance of these birds, group of birds in this case, have changed their annual abundance relative to the long-term mean. One thing you can see from the graph on the left is with the fish-eating birds, these are murres and puffins, murrets and guillemots all combined. They show quite a dramatic shift towards lower abundance after about 2014 and 2015. On the other hand, on the right are this is just for the North Bering Sea. The plankton eaters, which are the 3 species of auklets in this case, have increased during that period mostly from 2015 to 2019 in the North Bering Sea. So there has been some changes in abundance and distribution, and some of that might have started from around 2014 or so. Now, if we're looking at changes in distribution, and this most recent paper we looked at specifically the 3 warmest years in record that up to, not including 2017 to 2019, and we compared that to earlier decade, 2007 to 2016. And what these 2 examples show, the maps I show for thick-billed murre on the left and least auklets on the right. And by each cell, we looked at if the birds increased or decreased and by how much during 2017 to 2019, this very warm water period. And what you can see with the thick-billed murres, they have, look at all this red up, there's a lot of blue down here in the Bering Sea and even in the lower southern Chukchi Sea, but they've increased actually in the more central and northern Chukchi Sea. And if you look at the least auklets over here, they sort of had a different change during those 3 warm years. They increased dramatically in the Chirikov Basin area in the northern Bering Sea and decreased through most of the Chukchi Sea, except for this little bit right up here along the shelf edge. So this is just 2 examples, but the point is that different species had different responses to this very warm period in the study region. So now we're looking at short-tailed shearwater migration. Just as an example, I mentioned that this is an important bird. In the summer, becomes over half of the birds that we see offshore there. On the far left is a map showing our annual surveys, and just to show you how the shearwaters start coming up from the Aleutian Islands up to the southern Bering Sea. They migrate up towards Bering Strait around mid-July. And then they increase through that area, particularly peaking around late August through early September in the Chukchi Sea. And then they start declining during that period. And then we have in the center map here, I do want to point out that although shearwaters are mainly eating krill up here, they will also eat small fish. They eat a variety of food, and so they're a bit omnivorous. And they can dive as well as feed on the surface. So this now the center map now focuses on in 2-week periods, showing the distribution of shearwaters moving up into the Chukchi during late July through September, increasing all this during this really heavy, the peak period around late August to early September. And then they start heading back south. And the breeders actually get back to their breeding sites in Australia in October. And then on the far right, this is that same map showing the difference in whether they've increased or decreased during those 3 warm years, 2017 to 2019, that's shown in the red. And they showed a very dramatic increase in the Chukchi Sea, even up into the northern Chukchi. This is around the Barrow Canyon area. So they're really, they've not so much increased their overall abundance, but have shifted north. So we have some species that have declined, like the common murres overall, some that have shifted their distribution a little bit north, like the thick-bill murres, and then like the short-tailed shearwaters here have gone dramatically further north and concentrated in the Chukchi during these warm years. And again, the short-tailed shearwaters don't breed here. They don't have to return to colonies to feed their chicks. They're just there where the food is. Now, we redid this analysis now I'm looking at the slide with changes in distribution of seabird communities during the warm period, 2017 to 2019. And it's a 2-panel map here. And the one on the left shows, we redid the cluster analysis, came out with the same types of seabird groups, clusters. And during the early period, this shows how these communities were distributed within this study period. In the more recent 2017 to 2019, there were changes in the community distributions. The main thing, there's 3 of these communities led by the 3 different alcid species actually contracted in space. And that's the thick-bill murre, the purple one here, although it's still concentrated up here by Cape Lisburne, disappeared a lot in the Bering Sea. The crested auklet up here, they did not move up there as much as they used to after breeding. And the least auklet contracted back down into the Chirikov Basin here. There were 2 groups that expanded, and that's the shearwater community. I showed you that map earlier, but this is now the community, much greater up here in the Chukchi Sea and in the Hope Basin. And then there's the low density community, which has expanded quite a bit from the east, which was always very low density. It's expanded west throughout this whole area. Unfortunately, we don't know what's happened to the birds over here in this area here. So I thought you were a little bit behind time here, partly. So I'll go through this a little quickly. What's been happening at the colonies. These are colonies monitored by the Alaska Maritime Refuge in 2018. They found a lot of colonies, mostly poor reproductive success for murres, kittiwakes, and particularly auklets. Mainly you can only tell if they're present or not. So reproduction was poor. As we mentioned earlier, they did have Seabird Die-offs. This is now looking at a map of the St. Matthew Island, a picture of the St. Matthew Island colony. And I do want to mention, however, that in 2019, the few colonies that they looked at, particularly Cape Lisburne, they did better. So now we're looking at what happened at the colony, what's happening at the colonies. Well, in fact, at Cape Lisburne up in the Chukchi Sea, these colonies have been increasing. And the productivity is not great, but it's okay. But the numbers at the colonies have been increasing by upwards of 4 to 6% at this colony in the Chukchi Sea. So this suggests immigration from the south. They probably could not increase just from productivity at the colonies alone. In terms of what's been happening with the zooplankton, I think because of time, we lost some time at the beginning. I'll have to run through this, but.
This is Gay. I don't think the audience is worried about time. So don't feel too constrained.
Okay. I did want to leave time for questions, but thanks. That's good to know. So this is data now from Dave Kimmel at NOAA. And in 2019, briefly, what the things they found were zooplankton community in the North Bering was much lower than in 2017. And then it was dominated by small copepods. Copepods are the zooplankton that the auklets eat. But whereas the large copepods were largely absent, and they need the large copepods to feed their chicks, basically. They bring it back in the gullet pouch and regurgitate it to the chicks. So they were able to, they weren't die-offs necessarily in large numbers. They hung around, they were very high abundance on offshore, the auklets, but they apparently didn't have enough of the high quality copepods to feed their chicks. Again, looking at the Chukchi Sea, this gets a little into the weeds here. We're looking at different copepods, were higher in 2017 and lower in 2019 in the Chukchi Sea. Small copepods were about the same, but they were much more concentrated down here in Hope Basin, almost absent up here in the northern parts. And euphausids, that's our northern krill, they were up, but very patchy again, mostly down here in the lower portion of the Chukchi. And as many of you know, without the ice in the Bering Sea, there was no cold pool for the first time ever in 2018, no thermal barrier. And this resulted in a lot of very large predatory fish coming up into the northern Bering Sea and even up into the Chukchi some. So these maps are again from NOAA, work done by Bob Louth and others. And NOAA, these hotspots here show where pollicar were in 2010. In 2017, they were way up here towards the North Bering Sea and even more so during 2018. So this was potential competition for forage fish and zooplankton. We don't know for sure, but there was definitely some impact from those. So in summary, during this warm period, there was low abundance of birds, or they shifted their distribution. The planktivore bird, the plankton-eating birds stayed in the North Bering Sea with little or no breeding. And some of the fish-eating birds did okay in the Chukchis, and in fact, some of their colonies are growing. But overall, there was very low reproductive success for seabirds, particularly in the North Bering Sea, and a low abundance or low quality of prey with very patchy distribution. In addition, possibly competition for the prey due to this large influx of large predatory fish. And of course, we saw some widespread mortality events that weren't huge by normal standards in the North Bering Sea or Chukchi, but nonetheless, they were uncommon. They were more than common. So in terms of, so all this indicates there was environmental stress happening. It affected both the planktivorous and piscivorous seabirds. So this suggests impacts at multiple trophic levels, and with the greatest effects perhaps in the Northern Bering Sea for seabirds. Now, changes in seabird distribution have been documented earlier. Adrian Gall and others published a paper showing that from the 1970s to 1980s, offshore waters had predominantly fish-eating birds, whereas after 2007 to about 2012, I think this data went, it was mostly planktivorous seabirds, and those were the least auklets and crested auklets and shearwaters that I showed you maps of their distribution earlier. So some of the questions we have are, how permanent are these changes? We know now that, for instance, the auklets didn't go into the Chukchi Sea as much during those warm periods, so maybe that's an opportunistic thing, feeding after they breed up there where there's lots of zooplankton and years when it's available. Will these changes continue along the same path? This is some of the things we'll be looking at long term, and can we predict what will happen in the future? Again, these are $64,000 questions, but we're still working on those. So I'm now looking at a slide that says other concerns. And of course, there's, besides climate change and changes to prey species, we have a lot of other things going on. There's the increase in vessel traffic and increase in potential commercial fishing. This is all going to bring pollution and contaminants, potential for invasive species and new diseases. So these are all things that might affect seabirds just as they affect us. And I do want to point out this picture on the left of Diomede Islands, one of my favorite places to sail by. I've never been lucky enough to be on shore, but it's really a hot spot for seabirds in the summer. Large numbers of auklets and other species breeding there, and they're right in the path of one of the most constricted Arctic pathways, which will be seeing increased traffic in the future as well. So this isn't news to anyone up there, and of course there have been a lot of reports dealing with this issue. And but in terms of seabirds, there's not been a really good comprehensive analysis of seabirds with respect to the increase in vessel traffic happening and anticipated to increase through the Bering Strait here, very sensitive areas. Oops. And for seabirds, this also increases the risk of vessel strikes as well as oil spills and disturbance and increased interactions with fisheries. The more boats you have up there late in the season in particular, with their lights on, that attracts birds migrating through the area. And because they are also concentrating the movement through the Bering Strait here, there's going to be some issues for the birds there. I did want to point out that there has been funding for a new risk assessment. Fish and Wildlife Service is working with USGS and others with the Northern Latitude Partners, and this effort has been spearheaded by Aaron Pohl with Alaska Conservation, and he'd be glad to tell you more about this. But basically we'll be purchasing automatic identification system data that all those large vessels have on them, so we can overlay their track lines with seabird abundance and colony locations and seasonal changes in their distribution. And that way we can help evaluate species or areas at risk and help plan shipping lanes to avoid high risk areas. We did find out today that in addition, we're pleased to hear that there's been some US Coast Guard and Russian Border Guard coordination. There's been an agreement signed to the bilateral joint contingency plan. This started in 1989, but it's been updated so that we can coordinate with Russia on monitoring traffic and pollution and all the issues that the Bering Strait region will be facing. I think that's a good development. And I did want to point out also that if you pull back from our area, the Bering Strait region, Alaska and Fish and Wildlife Service is involved with the Arctic Council's expert group, the Circumpolar Seabird group, and we've helped along with many of the other expert networks to produce the State of the Arctic Marine Biodiversity Report, which you can get online on the CAF site. And looking at some of these species, they put together a very crude summary, and certainly compiling this much data into one graphic has its issues, but nonetheless, there is some indication that the Alaska seabirds, this is the Pacific Arctic here, indicated here, this data goes to 2015, and this is our update on the right, 2016 to 2019 really, because there was very little data collection in 2020. But despite all of our issues, we may be doing a little better than the Atlantic region. So sometimes it's good to pull back and take a circumpolar view of how we stand in terms of trends in our seabirds and issues that we face. So that's it, and I hope there's time for questions. I was hoping we wouldn't go over, but had some technical glitches to deal with. So.
Tonight in Nome, time is not a problem, I don't think. We're all sort of homebound with our weather. But thank you so much, Kathy. And I know I've got questions, but I think it would be better you just got rid of your screen, so that's fine. And I'll throw it open to the group. Any questions? That was a lot of information, Kathy, and a lot of good information, and timely, especially with interesting about the zooplankton. Holy cow, I hadn't seen that.
And I'd be glad to share the screen again and show the slides if there's questions related to a specific.
All right, well, I'll wait in line. Who would like to ask Kathy a question about all that good information about the seabirds? A lot of varied stuff there. I'll begin then. I know that I've got a question when you were talking about vessel strikes. I don't know if you're aware, Kathy, but there's a lot of, not a lot, there's ship traffic still in the area right now. So we have had these 980-foot tankers, Russian LNG liquid natural gas tankers that have been transiting, making the news here and transiting between Russia and Big Diomede. We've had 3 plus a Russian icebreaker. And just since January began, since 21 began. And I was curious about the, is there any information about wintertime ship strikes or lights at night in the wintertime in ice? The birds seem to be in areas, we have a lot of ice is moving and breaking. We have leads kind of this high wind too. We've got ice moving around. The birds seem to be in those open water areas further north, and now we have ship traffic. Is that something that is, I'm sure those tankers are lit up like a city when they go by.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. I mean, as you know, the spectacled eider overwinters in the North Bering Sea, and a lot of birds are migrating to the area. If the water is open, they will probably use it as much as they can, and they're out there at night. Some of the eider species are sticking around there, and there's actually about 19 species that have been recorded in the northern Bering Sea area, or even in the southern Chukchi in November, October, December. We don't, of course, have surveys up there, but there might be band radio tracking information, satellite tracking for some of the eiders. But we do know that there have been studies. This is a real problem, not just here in the Bering Strait, but it's been a long-term problem as well on the Atlantic side. And there have been studies, I think out of Iceland, that looked at patterns of vessel strikes. And it's because of these large vessel transiting at night. When you have a storm or heavy fog, or particularly at night, the vessel lights do either disorient or attract the birds. And it shows that definitely an increase of vessel strikes during stormy, dark weather. Dark, stormy nights are bad for birds when there's vessels with bright lights on. So there are seasonal patterns. And basically where you have birds and vessels with lights in the darkness, there are issues with that. So it is going to be a problem. As you know, we had some vessel strikes in the Bering Strait region and in the further south in the Bering Sea this past winter, late fall. And for the spectacled eider, that's a big issue because it's an endangered species. And it's something that Fish and Wildlife and others and the partners involved with that issue are concerned about, and trying to advertise best practices for vessels. And of course, we can deal with, on the US side, we can put out educational material. We can request, we have forms so they can report when this happens. So we at least have a record of when and where birds are at risk. For the international traffic that's going to be going through the strait, that's a whole nother issue. I don't know how we can deal with that, but I think you're going to have a talk about spectacled eiders. You said
there is for everybody listening, there is a Strait Science on 25th of February, particularly on spectacled eider movements with the change in the ice. Yeah. It doesn't really involve ship strikes, but it may come up in the discussion.
Yeah, so I'm sure Dan can give you more detail on that issue.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It is something on our mind, especially when we're talking about long periods of darkness during, right on the.
Yeah, with more, it didn't used to be an issue because the boats couldn't go up there,
right.
During the dark periods of the year when it was dark, and now they're up there, as you know. It's a problem.
You do have a question in the chat box. I know that this talk was particularly on a lot of offshore, but the Metcalfs have a question. We were wondering whether Kathy knows or has engaged local communities to do local observations or bird counts.
In terms of birds moving by the coast or colony-based counts?
Probably something to do near shore, more near shore where people are.
Yeah. I have not myself, although I've been in communication with some folks. I know that Alexis Will, I think, who's been working on St. Lawrence Island with the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I believe she has been working with some community members there to help monitor the colonies there. But that would certainly be, obviously the Maritime Refuge is focused on maritime lands, National Wildlife Refuge lands. And so it would be good to have more information on those areas that are not part of the National Wildlife Refuge. Definitely.
Any other question for Kathy? And I know I'm trying to text. I think Diamond, I may have inadvertently put them on mute, which I can't see. Ah, there you go. Thank you. Diamond, I could see you trying. All right, we can hear you now. You have a question for Kathy.
Okay, yep. Hi, Kathy.
Hi.
So I'm looking at your page with, I'm looking at the page with the established sample sites, you know, the map with the stars.
Yeah.
She's calling it up right now.
Where, can you hear me okay?
Yep, she's calling up that slide right now so we can all see.
Okay, well, so I'm just wondering, when you're at your sample sites, how long and how many samples are you taking from these sites?
Are you talking about the colony sites?
Yep.
Okay. I haven't myself been doing colony work. All my work has been offshore, but the Alaska Maritime Refuge has people that work mainly at Cape Lisburne, a little bit at Cape Thompson, and on St. Matthew Island. And then I think the University of Alaska Fairbanks has had a project on St. Lawrence Island near Gamble, I think. And they've been working those sites over a few years, off and on. The Cape Lisburne site is probably only visited every 3 years, I think. The same with St. Matthew, rarely. Most of it's hard for the refuge to get up there, both logistically and financially. So yeah, that's, those sites, the numbers that we have there, some of those are historic estimates and really need to be updated. So it would be great to get more up-to-date counts of the birds at these colonies. So some of these are quite old estimates.
So
I remember back in, I think it was 98, when we had U.S. Fish and Wildlife here doing bird counts on population and productivity. And there were a couple of guys from U.S. Fish and Wildlife that came and stayed throughout the summer from June to August. And they established 13 plots throughout our island. I remember on the north side, maybe 9 plots, and then I got to have my own plot on the south side, and then on the east valley, and I know Gay Sheffield can see what I'm talking about, the east valley, the east side of our island, we established maybe 3 plots back there, so it was pretty much every day we were doing population productivity count throughout the summer and visiting all those sites. Well, not all the sites every day, so we had to decide which days we were going to do the north side and then the south side. I think it would be really important for a project like that to happen here on Diomede again. If we could, maybe work with somebody, maybe Queric or somewhere in Nome can set up something for, locals here to go in and collect that information, because we do get all these seabirds.
Absolutely. It's been, as you mentioned, you said that was about in 1998. That sounds about right. It's all those sites up there, particularly the Diomedes, King Island, we need to have updated information because the changes that have happened, but also what of the risk that they are now in, being in the middle of the Bering Strait, as ice disappears and traffic increases. I think it's very timely that we get some updated information there. And it's difficult for Fish and Wildlife to get money to work on non-refuge land. There's already so much that they have to cover. The Fish and Wildlife working on the Maritime refuge colony sites. But the Diomede is so important, as are the colonies on St. Lawrence Island and other areas in that Bering Strait region. So, and King Island is one. So I would be glad to try to help and explore options for doing that. What you discussed, having a local team, and it's, as you know, it's difficult. The species are difficult to work there because they're crevice nesters, many of them, the auklets. So you can't just count them on the cliffs like the murres and the kittiwakes. But it's worth making the effort. I agree.
You know, but we did. We were able to establish plots throughout the cliffs. So what we did was, you know, we took our cameras and, you know, zoomed in and, you know, took a picture of a good spot where there was going to be so many murre, you know, nesting. And usually these birds come back to the same nest sites every year. So these birds, they're nesting on the cliffside, and we shoot this picture, and then we go and we pull this picture out and use it as a map. And so of all the birds that are, you know, the birds when they're sitting on their nests, we're circling all of these birds, you know, because they're on nests, and we put numbers on them, 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, 1 through 20 something. So every day we're able to go and count whether it's a common or a thick-billed murre. We can go in and we can count if that bird is there, you know, with our population count. And then when they have their eggs and then their babies, we come in and we do the productivity count. But it can be done.
Yeah, and particularly now, I think you know, technology has come a long way since the 90s when that was first done. So there's now more use of drones for doing remote colony works. Better photography methods, having study plots that you've already got established there makes it particularly valuable. I mean, now you could go back there and get shots of those same spots and compare it to that earlier work. It's very valuable to have that.
Yeah,
data.
I would be worried to use a drone, you know, on these nesting. I mean, if you were to establish plots there where the birds are flying in and out, I wouldn't use a drone.
So,
you know?
OPIC, this is Gay. Were you guys given a report when that project was over in 1998? Or do you have any kind of,
yep.
You do have that report? It might be good. Maybe we can talk offline about who wrote it and where did it go to, and maybe see about following up with that, with those people or that organization, whoever. If it was Fish and Wildlife, then certainly Fish and Wildlife had money to do something at that time. Maybe they can.
Yeah, I think
sounds like people would be very interested.
Yep, we can find that information. I'm pretty sure we have to look online. It was a long time ago.
And I'll look it up too. Yep. I'm pretty sure I could find it. I mean, if it rings a bell.
Yep. So I have one more question, and I hope I don't mean to steal people's time, but I'm looking at the page with the changes in the distribution from 2017 and 2019, that warm period. So you have two maps, one that says 2007 to 2016, and then you have another one with 2017 to 2019. And then you have clusters 1 through 5.
Oh, the clusters.
I see on the map, on both maps, you know, and if I'm looking at Diomede, your cluster is cluster 3 least auklet, you know, and I don't see why you didn't put cluster 4 there, because least auklet and crested auklet are always fly together.
Yeah, well, the way this analysis worked, there's certainly, there are crested auklets in the least auklet cluster community.
Okay.
We define it, we call it the least auklet one because it's easiest, it's the dominant species. But let me go back up here to this graphic here.
This, she's
so
on.
This is the least auklet.
One sec, Kathy. Kathy just went to the slide that says seabird communities in Pacific Arctic on top, and then there's like a.
There's the distribution of the different clusters, a map on the left, and then there's a series of bar graphs, and it shows the different species in each of those clusters. And if you look at the least auklet cluster has that's the biggest, tallest bar there. It has the most birds per kilometer square. So the red represents the least auklet, but if you look 2 colors up, the green, the crested auklet is also in that group. So it's just they do cluster together in time and space there. This is just, in this particular cluster, the least auklet is the dominant one. But they do occur there.
And I have, oh, go ahead, Opa, keep going. Does that answer your second question?
Nope, but she answered my question. Thank you very much. No, I don't have another one.
Okay, no, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say, Kathy, one of my questions was you did have, looking at that first map you put on, that at Diomede, you know, you're saying that the krill was much lower, like the big copepods were not around, it sounds like, and the what food was around, what copepods were around, were half as abundant. Is that correct? And that the birds didn't breed, but they stayed at Diomede. And I forgot the year that was. Was it 20?
Are you talking about this? Yeah, it shows changes in distribution 2017 to 2019.
Yes, the take home I got from your talk was that in that area, the planktivorous, the birds that eat the krill, like auklets, they stayed even though maybe the food was less, but they didn't breed. Correct.
There were, if I remember correctly, and of course this is simplifying the zooplankton data perhaps, but there were a lot of, during this warm period, there were a lot of small zooplankton, small-bodied copepods, and not a lot of really large, fat, high-density, high food value copepods. So normally in this map here, I'm showing now the changes in distribution. The map on the right is for the least auklet. Normally after breeding, they would be breeding here, and then they, like August, September even, they would be up here, and the crested auklets would even go way up in here to feed on the abundant zooplankton, even though they don't nest on any of these colonies down here. So it appeared that you see all these blue cells here indicate the numbers had gone down. So the least auklets, which were very abundant, so it's not like they died or disappeared. They are very abundant offshore. The reports were that they did not show up at the colonies or didn't breed or bred, few of them bred very late in the year. So they might have been able to hang around here and eat small copepods. A bird that can forage for itself offshore can eat a whole lot of small copepods, but if they need to feed chicks, they need the very large-bodied copepods, which weren't around during those warm years. There you can see a little bit of difference up there. There are still some birds up that have increased a bit up here along the shelf break. That's this area of upwelling, and there might have been some other food source there for the non-breeding birds to go to, but it's got to be worth their while to go up here. And normally after breeding, these birds need to replenish their fat reserves. They spent a lot of energy raising chicks all summer, and they go to where the food is most abundant. And that apparently has been in the past 10 years or so, has been up here in the Chukchi Sea.
And you have another question in the chat box. Are you continuing to see a northward shift with albatrosses too? If so, how far north?
Oh. I haven't looked at that recently. As you know, we did have a paper a few years ago that showed that there has been a definite increase in albatross, all 3 species, and they have shifted more northward. And in 2011, I'm going to make a little dot right up around here. There was actually a short-tailed albatross, first time and first ever in the Chukchi Sea. We have not seen any obvious indications of further movement north of the albatrosses. but
Thank
we're still increasing. Yeah.
Thank you. And there's also, because Dean Stockwell is very good at these reactions, or his control of Zoom is masterful. He and Charlie Lean both have their hands raised. So why don't we start with Dean, since I saw his hand first. Dean Stockwell, if you want to unmute and ask Kathy your question.
Yeah. Hi, Kathy. Nice talk, first of all. I'm going to ask you kind of an off-the-wall question. Here in the interior, we have a lot of small birds that move through the area in the winter. They basically have to eat their body weight every day to survive the cold of the night. Once you're over water in the northern Bering and the Chukchi, you have ice cover and darkness, and your planktivorous and fish-eating birds still have to be fed. So how do they have to fly all the way out to an ice edge every day to maintain their energetics? And I know you don't have a lot of data on that, but just your thoughts.
Well, we do know that a lot of these birds do move. I said they move up here in the north after breeding, which a lot of birds, we found it's kind of like a reverse migration. After breeding down here, a lot of these birds move up north and feed up in the Chukchi, but then they go head back south again. So they don't stay up there for the winter. Certainly some of them might follow the ice edge, like the black guillemots ice edge, but most of them head further south out into the middle of the Bering Sea, all the way down to the Aleutians, birds that have been satellite tagged. And this is the crested and least stalklets. Others have done this work. And a lot of them head to the west, where there's a lot more open water, and the rich anadir current keeps running. So they head south and to the west, near as we can tell.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Don't stay in the ice.
All right, thank you, Kathy. And Charlie, you had your hand up if you want to unmute.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is very interesting. I wanted to relate a funny story. A couple years ago, a bald eagle got on a ship at Seward in pretty poor weather, and the weather really was poor all the way up, and about 5 miles out of Nome, he left the ship and flew into Nome and spent the rest of the summer being quite the showboat here in Nome. I think he was a male. He was kind of a smaller bald eagle, but he traveled as far as Council and back to Nome and different places. Because he was unique, he was easy to track. Anyway, and on the previous question, I've seen kitlets, murrelets on the leads and the ice off of Nome this time of year. So they're feeding in the leads right off Nome, not at the ice edge. My question was more about the data, and it seems like all your samples are out beyond the Alaska nearshore current line, Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sound being very much affected by the Alaska nearshore current, and the current has been known to be far warmer than it was, say, 20 years ago. So the Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sounds are very warm these days. Does that double down the effect for birds like at Bluff and other places here locally?
My guess would be yes, but you're right. We don't have good data for those areas. Most of the ships that we're on don't go in there, for one. Even going back into the 70s when surveys did start, and the few times that we have been into those inner waters, the densities are very low. And you can kind of see that from, I'm going to show you now here, this is the title. The title of this slide is Changes in Distribution of Seabird Communities during the warm period. And this brown color here are the cells where there's very low density. And that actually, this is what we cut off here because they had a really good sample size. But if you go further in here, that continues. It's very low density. And that was been recognized since the 70s when first seabird surveys were conducted in offshore waters, that it's a particularly low density, low productivity area. My guess is that with the warm temperatures, they would be much more affected. And that might be one reason why we've seen this expansion during this warm period, these most recent 3 years, this expansion of this low density area. That, and these are also areas where there's breeding colonies, as you know, of common murres are fairly common. The fish-eating birds were closer to shore there often, not the auklets. And we've seen a decline in offshore waters in general of common murres, plus they have been most affected by the die-offs often. And so it's very possible that that they've been affected by the increased warming in those more nearshore waters as well. But we don't have real good data for that right now.
Thank you, Kathy. Charlie, does that answer your question?
I think so. I remember, you know, 20 years ago going past Bluff and just it was phenomenal watching all the puffins and murres come off the cliff. I probably shouldn't have been that close, but anyway, then more recently it's nothing like it was. So
yeah, and there is some colony data for Bluff, and I can't recall the trends there right now. But it'd be worth looking at some of those colonies again, just as with the Diomedes. Some of those data are old and need to be updated, or some kind of monitoring set up. So that would be good. And I did want to mention that you mentioned the Kitlitis murrelet in the open leads, and that is one of the few species that of alcid that do hang around in the open leads in the spring and winter. It's been kind of cool to find out more about that.
So Kathy, how are you doing? Can you take a few more questions? Sure. We've got Rick Toman patiently with his hand electronically raised. Rick, if you want to unmute, and then we'll do Diomede. I see Diomede wants to get on as well. Thanks, Opik.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Great presentation, Kathy. I just wanted to follow up on Charlie's question there. And you had mentioned there's just not that much information in Norton Sound on this. And it just strikes me that, boy, that would be, I would really be interested to hear what the elders in the Norton Sound communities have to say about changes in summer seabirds in the region. That might be, to me, as a non-bird specialist, that would be really quite interesting. But that's it, thanks.
I agree. So we have, there's a need to engage local monitoring, it sounds like, in the Diomede Islands and in the Norton Sound region.
And it sounds like maybe also traditional or local expertise over time, historical.
Yeah, regional. Yeah. Like Charlie mentioned, that seeing the large numbers of birds flying off the cliffs and at that colony and at Bluff, and doesn't seem to be
throughout the whole Bering Strait region. We have some amazing bird colonies and some amazing expert observers.
Right. I remember being on the ship going by past the Diomedes, and I can't remember who it was. It was a local person saying, I was amazed at the birds and I love being out there and watching them all. And she said, "Oh, this is nothing. There used to be many more."
Yeah, good information.
Yeah.
Kathy, that was me. It was,
okay,
it was me. I was standing right next.
Yeah. Well done.
Together, that's right.
Opik, do you have a question too? Did you want to? I heard you earlier. I could see you were trying to light up. Do you have another question for our speaker tonight? If so, have at it.
Okay. So I was just wondering, on your survey sites, you know, in the Bering Sea, in your sites, have you seen algal blooms in these waters?
You mean when we've been on a ship in the Bering Seas, have we seen evidence of harmful algal blooms?
No, when you're doing your surveying.
Yeah, I haven't myself seen obvious evidence of that. And the other observers, and including Marty Reedy, I think, who's on the call here now, he's been out to see quite a lot up there, and he has traveled through areas of the coccolithophore blooms, and those can cover large areas. That's what covers the water, makes it this opaque blue, and that has been associated with Seabird Die-offs. We're not sure why. It's not toxic itself to the birds, but it could possibly affect their feather, their ability to stay warm and dry. So, or it might affect their ability to forage visually. But we've certainly, during the times we've been out there at sea, when we've collected this data, there have been occurrences of elevated toxic algal bloom, like saxitocin. And when we, you know, many of you have collected birds and sent them to us, and we've sent them down to the USGS lab where they've been analyzed here in Anchorage, and it's almost always the birds have died of starvation. That doesn't mean that they have not been exposed to some of the toxins and harmful algal blooms, but a few have had elevated instances of saxitocin. But for the most part, they seem to be starved. And like I said, it's not to say this toxin goes through birds so quickly, they metabolize so quickly, it's very possible that they were affected by it and weren't able to forage very well. So that's still a lot of work to be done in that area.
Thank you.
And thank you, Opik. I also too noted in this talk that harmful algal blooms were not a part of the repertoire. So as someone who's been involved in multi-year, as everyone in our region has, in multi-year, multi-species seabird die-offs, and the birds, the commonality for all these different types of birds was emaciation. They were what made them so absolutely in such horrific body condition. And I think that USGS has given us some indication now that the harmful algal bloom at this time is crossed off the list as not a suspect. It is looking more and more as if it is absolutely, we've crossed off disease, wasn't disease, doesn't seem to be HABs at this point, and we're getting down to where it was only food. Seems to be we're crossing off the different items that it could have possibly, the different things that it might have been, and now we're just looking at food. So I'm really appreciative that you were showing us some data offshore, because we were missing a lot of birds on cliffs and things like that during 2017 and 18 and even 19. And what it sounds like, and this is, I guess, a question forming, is that given your offshore survey work that you were able to do, where people onshore like myself, we can only see what's washing in or what's on the cliffs, what's in the air above us on land, near shore. Is one of the things that you're saying as a take home was that the offshore indicates that, you know, the birds weren't all dying. There was, if this was food limited, they were moving to a different location, or you were saying plenty of birds offshore.
Well, certainly it depended on the species. The evidence we have indicates that, and this is true for seabirds in general, they're a very long-lived animal. They're what they call K-selected species. They don't produce very many young, maybe one a year for the ouses, maybe up to 3 for a gull. But they might live, you know, 20, 30, up to 60 years for the larger albatross or more. So for them to, if they run into a difficult year, they're going to not breed, or they'll even abandon their eggs or their chicks and save themselves. It's the breeding bird is a valuable commodity for the population in that sense. And so they can go without breeding for quite a long time, for several years. They only have to raise successfully 1 or 2 chicks in their lifetime, essentially, to replace themselves. So yeah, there's evidence, as I mentioned, some of these birds, like the thick-billed murre, can feed on krill. It eats euphausids a lot as an adult. It also eats fish. It's known generally as a fish eater, but the adult can eat a lot of krill, and it can do that offshore and support itself and survive. But it can't, it needs a lot of really high energy fish that available that it can bring near its colony, near enough to its colony to raise a chick. So some birds like the thick-billed murred appear that they shifted further north, perhaps because there was more krill up there and more fish offshore. They can eat smaller fish. They can survive on small fish, whereas they need the bigger forage fish for their chicks. The same with in the case of the auklets, they appeared to not show up at the island, or they didn't breed, but we had no evidence that they were dying necessarily. They were certainly abundant in the offshore waters around in the Chirikov Basin. And we couldn't even see, there's some indication that there were the highest densities of all these birds were towards the west, where we couldn't really survey right at the edge of the Anadir Current, which is a very rich current. But then on the other hand, there are birds like, especially the common murre, which really did seem to climb both throughout the northern Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea. So, and those are mainly fish eaters. For whatever reason, the murres require a lot of food to maintain their weight daily. And so I think it's something like a third of their weight. I can't recall offhand, but they don't seem to be doing as well as some of the other birds. And so, yeah, it varied by species. And that's why we see that some of them shifted in distribution, but we do see evidence of a real decline in some species offshore.
Well, thank you, Kathy. Hope that answers the question for the speaker, and thank you, because you've had a number of questions, and I think it's been an interesting discussion. I'm going to ask that everybody in the group, give a little love to Kathy. It's not easy to be a straight science speaker and speak to a screen, and lights are flashing and all that, and with all our internet and whatnot. So feel free to put it in the chat box. I am going to give a shameless plug. Tomorrow night, it's very unusual that we have a double header, but tomorrow night, Friday night at 6:30, we do have the U.S. Coast Guard commanding officer who will be beaming in from the Polar Star. Now,